Consider the nature of a fact. To a human being, a fact is a solid, unyielding anchor in the stream of time. It is a measurement, a date, a witnessed event, or a signature on a page. We build our entire civilization on the belief that facts are consistent. We believe that if you record a moment accurately, that moment belongs to history. But what happens when you encounter a reality that does not recognize your facts? What happens when the very tools we use to measure our existence, our clocks, our engines, our senses, and our memories, are treated as nothing more than temporary variables by an intelligence that operates outside our legal and physical framework? This is not a story about a ghost or a monster. This is a story about a forensic collision. It is the moment when the law of man, represented by a sworn officer of the state, crashed into the protocol of the others. And in that collision, the law of man was found to be utterly, terrifyingly irrelevant. On the night of December 3rd, 1967, Patrolman Herbert Schirmer was the personification of human order. He was 22 years old, a veteran of the United States Navy, and a patrolman for the town of Ashland, Nebraska. His world was small, cold, and meticulously organized. It was a world of black and white cruisers, silver badges, and the steady, rhythmic scratch of a pen against a duty log. In 1967, the plains of Nebraska were not a place of mystery. They were a place of routine. The night shift was a sequence of checkpoints, checking the locks on the local cattle yards, watching the red taillights of long-haul trucks disappear into the darkness of Highway 6, and sipping lukewarm coffee while the radio hissed with the comfort of familiar voices. Schirmer was a man trained to spot the out of place. He was an observer by trade and by temperament. He believed that if something was wrong, he could fix it, or at the very least he could report it. He had no way of knowing that by 2:20 a.m. he would encounter something that had no intention of being reported. The event did not begin with a scream or a flash of light. It began as a traffic violation. As Schirmer turned his cruiser onto the junction of Highways 6 and 63, he saw what he thought was a large transport truck stopped in the middle of the road. He saw red, pulsating lights. His training immediately took over. A stopped vehicle on a dark highway is a hazard, a breach of the rules. He pulled his cruiser closer, intending to issue a warning or offer assistance. But as his headlights swept over the object, the truck began to dissolve as a concept. It wasn't a vehicle. It was a polished metallic oval, shimmering with a dull, aluminum-like finish. It had no tires. It had no windows that he could see. It was hovering just a few feet above the asphalt, a silent heavy weight that seemed to displace the very air around it. And then the first glitch in the physical world occurred. Schirmer's cruiser, a machine built for power and reliability, suddenly ceased to exist as a functional tool. The engine did not sputter. It died instantly, as if the concept of internal combustion had been deleted from the local area. The headlights flickered and vanished. The police radio, his only link to the human world, went stone dead. But the most unsettling detail was the silence. Schirmer later described it not as the absence of noise, but as a perimeter of silence. The wind stopped. The insects stopped. The very vibration of the earth seemed to be suppressed by an invisible hand. In this moment, Schirmer moved from being a participant in human society to being a subject in a clinical procedure. He was no longer a police officer. He was a biological unit located within a controlled environment. As Schirmer sat in the dark, paralyzed by a combination of fear and a physical pressure he couldn't name, figures emerged from beneath the craft. They were thin, roughly 5 feet tall, wearing tight-fitting silver suits that appeared to be made of a liquid-like mesh. They wore helmets with dark visors, and on their chests was a winged emblem, a bird or a serpent, a symbol of an authority that did not answer to the state of Nebraska. They moved with a terrifyingly efficient gliding motion. They did not look like explorers. They did not look like invaders. They looked like technicians. They walked toward his car with the same calm, measured gait a mechanic might use when approaching a broken machine. They didn't look at Schirmer with curiosity. They looked at him with the same indifference a human might feel when looking at a blade of grass. When the door to his cruiser was opened, Schirmer didn't reach for his gun. He couldn't. His will had been paused. He was led toward the craft, his feet moving but his mind screaming in a silent, locked room. Inside, the environment was clinical, bathed in a soft green light that had no visible source. There were no buttons, no dials, no screens, only smooth, seamless surfaces that felt like they were grown rather than manufactured. And here, the selection protocol reached its peak. Schirmer was not interrogated. He was not met. He was scanned. He described a sensation of knowing things without words being spoken. He was told, or rather, the information was deposited into his brain, that they came from a place of great distance, that they used the power of electromagnetism, and that they had been here for a very long time. But the most chilling part of the communication was the tone. It was not a message of peace or a threat of war. It was a status report. To them, Schirmer was a specimen to be checked, tagged, and released back into the wild. By the time Schirmer found himself back in his cruiser, watching the craft rise silently into the night sky like a departing thought, his internal clock was broken. He looked at his watch and saw that only a few minutes had passed, but his body felt as if it had been through an ordeal of hours. His head throbbed with a psychic pressure so intense it felt like his skull was being crushed from the inside. He drove back to the station, his hands shaking, his mind struggling to reconstruct the facts of the night. He sat at his desk, the familiar smell of old paper and stale coffee now feeling alien and hollow. He picked up his pen. He opened the logbook. But the man who had started the shift was gone. In his place was someone who had seen the backstage of reality. He wrote a single haunting sentence: saw a flying saucer at the junction of Highways 6 and 63. Believe it or not. This is the point where the official narrative tries to close the file. The military arrived. The Condon Committee, the government's official UFO investigation task force, sent researchers to Ashland. They interviewed Schirmer. They put him through psychological tests. They used the term hallucination. They used the term stress-induced fantasy. They tried to turn the pattern back into a glitch, but the physical evidence told a different story. There were strange, scorched marks on the road. There were electromagnetic anomalies in the cruiser. And most importantly, there was the missing time. Schirmer thought he was gone for 10 minutes. The logs and the radio checks proved he was gone for much longer. Where was he during those missing minutes? And why did his brain choose to delete the footage of his own abduction? The Schirmer case is the foundational glitch in the history of law enforcement. It is the moment when a man whose entire life was dedicated to the truth realized that the truth is a matter of frequency. We live in a world governed by the laws of physics and the laws of men, but Schirmer found the place where both laws fail. He found the unmanaged margin of the universe, and as he sat in that station, listening to the tick of a clock that no longer made sense, he realized a truth that should haunt every one of us. The authorities we trust to protect us have no protocol for what happens when the predator doesn't recognize our existence. This leads us to the heart of the mystery. If Herbert Schirmer was just a routine check-in for these beings, how many other routine check-ins are happening right now? How many other patrolmen, truckers, and late-night travelers are being processed and reset without ever knowing it? We like to think of our lives as a continuous, unbroken thread. But the Schirmer case suggests that our thread is full of knots, minutes and hours that have been cut out, edited, and rewritten by an intelligence that sees our memory as just another piece of hardware to be managed. If the law of man is just a suggestion to them, then what is the real law of the planet? And more importantly, if they have the power to pause a sworn officer of the law, what is stopping them from pausing all of us? The question isn't whether Schirmer was lying. The question is, what is still hidden in the missing 20 minutes of his life that was so dangerous, it had to be buried under a headache and a lie. To understand why a seasoned police officer like Herbert Schirmer could lose 20 minutes of his life while standing in the middle of an open highway, we have to look past the flashing lights and the silver suits. We have to look at the fundamental architecture of the human brain. We are biological machines designed for a very specific environment. Our minds are built to process linear time, three-dimensional space, and a narrow spectrum of physical laws that we call common sense. But the Schirmer case suggests that there is a limit to what the human hardware can process before it simply shuts down. To the others, our consciousness is not a sacred mystery. It is a programmable interface with a very low bandwidth. And when they interact with us, they don't just violate our laws, they bypass our reality. Imagine for a moment an old analog radio from the 1940s, a bulky wooden box filled with vacuum tubes and copper wire. It is a masterpiece of its era, perfectly designed to catch waves of sound moving through the air. Now, imagine you try to force a modern high-speed fiber optic data stream into that radio. What happens? The radio doesn't suddenly start playing high-definition video. It doesn't become smarter. It smokes. Its components overheat. Its speakers emit a piercing, distorted scream, and then it goes silent. The hardware simply cannot handle the frequency. This is the most accurate way to describe what happened to Herbert Schirmer's mind on that Nebraska highway. He wasn't just scared. He was experiencing cognitive overload. Our brains were forged in the fires of survival on the African savanna. We evolved to track the movement of a predator in the grass or to judge the distance of a throwing spear. Our perception is a survival filter that discards 99% of the data hitting our senses because that data isn't necessary for staying alive. We see the world in low resolution because that's all we need, but the intelligence behind the Schirmer encounter operates in the high resolution gaps of our reality. When they stepped into Schirmer's world, they didn't just walk into a field, they injected a high bandwidth signal into a low bandwidth biological receiver. The result was a neurological glitch that we call missing time. Think about the headache Schirmer reported, the crushing psychic pressure that felt like his skull was being squeezed from the inside. In the official reports, this was dismissed as stress. But if we look at it through the lens of our radio analogy, that headache was thermal noise. It was the physical heat generated by a human brain trying to process a signal it was never meant to receive. When the beings spoke to Schirmer, they weren't using vocal cords. They were using injected knowing, direct data transfer into the temporal lobes. But because our brains are designed for language, for words with beginnings and ends, this instant knowing creates a massive conflict in our neural circuitry. The brain tries to buffer the information, to slow it down, to turn it into something recognizable. And when it fails, it simply deletes the footage to protect the system from crashing. This is why Schirmer's memory was edited. It wasn't necessarily a deliberate act of censorship by the beings, though it might have been, but a self-defense mechanism of the human mind. The missing 20 minutes weren't missing because nothing happened. They were missing because too much happened. The others move at a different clock speed than we do. To them, 20 minutes might be enough time to conduct a full biological survey, a neurological scan, and a historical download. But to Schirmer's analog brain, that flood of data was like a tidal wave hitting a teacup. The system reached its critical latency, and the memory was never written to the hard drive. But why the paralysis? Why the perimeter of silence that Schirmer described so vividly? This is where the pattern seeker finds the most chilling evidence of a protocol. In our daily lives, we believe that our muscles move because our brain tells them to. It's a closed loop of authority. But the Greys seem to possess a master override. They don't have to tie you down or use physical restraints. They simply jam the signal between your motor cortex and your limbs. They pause your biological clock. When Schirmer found himself unable to move, he wasn't experiencing a medical condition. He was experiencing signal suppression. He was being held in a pocket of space-time where the laws of human biology were temporarily suspended. To the rest of the world, Schirmer was a police officer in Nebraska. But inside that perimeter, he was a specimen in a zero-G environment of the mind. We have to ask ourselves, why did they choose a police officer? Why a man whose entire identity was built on human authority? If you wanted to test the effectiveness of your override, you wouldn't test it on a sleeping child. You would test it on the security protocol of the species. You would test it on the man with the badge and the gun. By neutralizing Schirmer, they weren't just taking a witness, they were validating the interface. They were proving that even the most disciplined, high-functioning human mind is a legacy system that can be hacked in seconds. The winged serpent on their silver suits wasn't just a decoration. It was a manufacturer's label. It was a reminder that they have been the admins of this planet long before we developed the concept of a law. The most disturbing part of the Schirmer case isn't the abnormal, it's the procedural. When Schirmer was taken inside the craft, he saw things that his brain struggled to categorize. He saw maps that weren't on paper, but in the air. He saw controls that responded to thought, not touch. But he didn't describe these things as magical. He described them as efficient. This is the technological chasm. When we look at a UFO, we see a mystery. When they look at their craft, they see a tool. We are like a primitive tribe looking at a smartphone. We don't see a communication device. We see a glowing rock that talks. Our error is in thinking that our inability to understand means that the phenomenon is ununderstandable. It isn't. It is just operating on a frequency we haven't discovered yet. Schirmer's hallucination was actually a translation error. His brain took the high-dimensional reality of the encounter and tried to render it using the limited graphics card of 1960s human experience. The silver suits, the green light, the telepathic voices, these were the best icons his mind could generate to represent a reality that was fundamentally alien. This is why the testimonies across decades are so structurally identical, but thematically different. The protocol stays the same, but the rendering changes based on the culture of the witness. In 1967, Schirmer saw technicians, In the 1800s, he might have seen angels or demons. In the future, we might see advanced AI, but beneath the skin of the story, the mechanism is always the same. The pause, the scan, the silence, and the edit. What if the missing time in the Schirmer case is not a bug, but a feature? What if the goal of the encounter wasn't just to study Schirmer, but to program him? There are researchers who suggest that abductees are actually human nodes being placed back into the population with latent instructions. We know that Schirmer's life was never the same after that night. He became restless. He lost his job. He felt like a stranger in his own town. He was a piece of legacy hardware that had been force updated, and now he no longer synced with the rest of the world. He was off frequency from his own species. This brings us to the neural scaffolding of the entire human race. If they can pause a police officer in 1967, and if they can edit the memory of a pilot in 1978, then what are they doing to the rest of us on a daily basis? We believe our memories are our own. We believe our now is the only now. But the Schirmer glitch suggests that our reality is a managed stream. We are the 99% who are being ignored by the protocol, but that doesn't mean we are safe. It just means we haven't been called to the desk for our check-in yet. Schirmer sat at his desk that night and wrote, "Believe it or not." It was the cry of a man who realized that his law was a sandbox, and that the real law was something much colder, much more clinical, and infinitely more powerful. He found the seam in the world, and as he looked through that seam, he didn't find God or the devil. He found a system that sees us as data, that sees our time as malleable, and that sees our autonomy as a minor obstacle to be managed in 60 seconds or less. The question we have to ask in the next part of this investigation is, what happened during those missing 20 minutes that was so important it had to be buried under a wall of psychic noise? Was it a biological procedure, or was it something more functional? Did Herbert Schirmer receive a message, or did he receive an assignment? The answer lies in the final sorting of the Schirmer files, and in the realization that the badge he wore was never the highest authority in the room. We are about to look at the protocol from the perspective of the admins, and what we find there will change the way you look at a police cruiser and a night sky forever. When we look at the wreckage of Herbert Schirmer's life after that December night, we are forced to confront a question that is much more disturbing than the existence of the craft itself. Why was he allowed to remember anything at all? If this intelligence possesses the power to pause a human being, to jam the electrical signals of a car engine, and to edit the cognitive stream of a trained observer, then the fact that Schirmer walked away with a glitchy memory is not a failure of their technology. It is a choice. We have to consider the possibility that the leakage in Schirmer's mind, the fragments of silver suits, the green light, and the winged serpent, was a deliberate data packet left behind. Schirmer wasn't just a subject of a study. He was being used as a relay station. The scientific community often tries to explain the Schirmer effect as a psychological breakdown, a fugue state triggered by loneliness and the isolation of the night shift, but that explanation collapses the moment you look at the structural consistency of the data. Schirmer described a knowing that he didn't have before. He spoke of the being's propulsion systems and their long-term monitoring of the planet with a level of technical confidence that was entirely out of character for a 22-year-old patrolman from a small town. This is what I call cognitive seeding. To the Greys, Schirmer was a node. By injecting a certain amount of knowing into a sworn officer of the law, they were testing how that information would diffuse into the human social substrate. They wanted to see how our systems of authority, the police, the military, the psychiatric institutions, would react to a corrupted piece of data. In the years following the encounter, Schirmer became a pariah. He was promoted to police chief, then pressured to resign. The town that he had sworn to protect turned against him, not because they thought he was lying, but because he represented a frequency they couldn't handle. He was a constant reminder that the order they believed in was a thin, fragile crust over an ocean of the unknown. This is the tragedy of the 1%. When the selection protocol chooses you, it doesn't just take your time, it takes your context. You are updated to a reality that your peers cannot see, and that lack of synchronization eventually tears your human life apart. Schirmer was a functional sacrifice in a larger experiment to measure the perceptual threshold of our species. But there is a deeper, more administrative layer to this mystery. If we look at the injected knowing Schirmer received, it wasn't a message of cosmic brotherhood. It was a logistical update. He was told that they monitor us to prevent us from destroying the resource, the planet. This implies that the Greys aren't visiting us, they are managing their estate. To them, we are like the cattle Schirmer was checking on Highway 6. We are a biological population that needs to be managed, culled, and tracked to ensure the long-term stability of the environment. The selection protocol is simply the inventory management system of an intelligence that views human history as a very long, very slow agricultural project. This brings us to the scientific solution of the missing 20 minutes. Modern quantum biology suggests that memory is not just stored in the neurons, but in the quantum vibrations of the microtubules within those neurons. If the Greys use technology that can manipulate these quantum fields, they can lock a memory so that it is inaccessible to the conscious mind, yet still present in the sublayer of the brain. Schirmer's headache wasn't just stress. It was the physical sensation of his consciousness trying to decrypt a file that had been password protected by an external source. The only way he could access it was through hypnosis, a state that bypasses the standard operating system of the brain and enters the kernel level where the raw data is stored. So, why does any of this matter to you, the 99% who have never seen the silver suits? It matters because the Schirmer case proves that we are witnesses of the gap. We live in the space between the protocols. The fact that we can even discuss these glitches, the fact that we can analyze the silence and the scan, means that the administrative layer is not perfect. There is leakage, and in that leakage, we find the true value of the human spirit. We are the scenery that has started to record the actors. We are a species that was designed to be managed, but which has developed the unauthorized curiosity to look back at the manager. Herbert Schirmer died in 2017. He spent 50 years of his life as a man who had seen too much and remembered just enough to be lonely. He was a police officer who found a law that his badge couldn't touch, but his legacy is not one of victimhood, it is one of resonance. By refusing to retract his story, by standing by that one haunting sentence in his logbook, he created a permanent ripple in the human frequency. He proved that even a single human mind, when faced with the infinite and the alien, can hold on to its internal truth. He was a specimen who insisted on remaining a witness. We are living in a managed reality, yes. We are surrounded by a protocol that treats us as biological data. But every time you look at a night sky and feel that shiver of recognition, every time you notice a glitch in your own routine, and every time you seek out the pattern behind the silence, you are performing an act of neurological rebellion. You are proving that the 99% are not just waste material. We are the potential energy of the universe. We are the observational hardware that was never supposed to get this smart. The selection protocol is clinical, it is precise, and it is ruthless. It separates the integrated from the ignored, but it cannot account for awareness. Once you know the sequence, once you understand the pause, the gaze, and the edit, you are no longer a passive subject. You are an active watcher. You are the glitch in their system. And as we continue to map these shadow files, we are building a manual of resistance for a species that is finally, slowly, waking up to its own place in the cosmic hierarchy. Herbert Schirmer sat in his cruiser and watched a craft depart into the Nebraska sky. He was left with a headache, a broken engine, and a story that no one wanted to hear. But he was also left with something that the others could never take away. The knowledge that the order he served was much larger, much stranger, and much more magnificent than his superiors could ever imagine. He had looked into the eyes of the void and survived to write it down. If you have ever felt that you are meant for more than the daily grind of the 99% frequency, if you have ever felt that the world is thinner than it appears, then you are already tuning in. You are already becoming a shadow watcher. There is a vast, silent conversation happening just outside your range of hearing, and we are here to help you decode it. We explore these seams in reality every single week, looking for the patterns that the admins would prefer we ignore. The story of Herbert Schirmer is not just a police report. It is a signal. It is a reminder that even in the smallest town, on the coldest night, the universal law is always in effect. And the only way to navigate that law is to keep your eyes open, your receiver tuned, and your autonomy intact. If you want to join us on the next investigation, as we look deeper into the selection criteria and the final sorting of our species, then think about subscribing to the channel. Let's keep hacking the protocol together, because the silence is only scary if you don't know how to listen to what it's actually saying. The pattern is everywhere. You just have to be willing to see the glitch. Stay curious. The others are watching, but now so are we. We have dissected the Schirmer case not as a mere ghost story or a tabloid mystery, but as a forensic failure of human authority when confronted with a superior administrative protocol. We have looked at the missing time, the injected knowing, and the neural editing that turned a sworn officer of the law into a biological relay station. But as we reach the final layer of this investigation, we have to look past the tragedy of Herbert Schirmer and toward the back door, the fundamental error in the selection protocol that gives the 99% our only true advantage. Because if the Greys are the admins of this planetary estate, then they have made the same mistake every powerful administrator makes. They have underestimated the unmanaged margin. They have underestimated us. To understand the back door, we have to return to that cold Nebraska highway and look at what the beings left behind. They didn't just leave a man with a headache and a broken cruiser. They left a glitch. The very fact that Herbert Schirmer was able to recall his encounter through hypnosis, the fact that he was able to describe the winged serpent emblem and the green light, proves that their editing software is not 100% effective on the human consciousness. In engineering, this is known as data leakage. When you try to compress a high-resolution file into a low-resolution format, some of the data bleeds through the edges. Schirmer's mind was the low-resolution format, and the protocol was the high-resolution file. The others believe they can manage us because they see us as legacy hardware, but they forget that legacy hardware has a mind of its own. This is the power of the ignored, because the selection protocol has judged 99% of humanity as irrelevant or deprecated. It does not waste energy on managing our perception. This is their greatest vulnerability. If you are not a target, if you are not part of the 1% being staged and utilized, then you are operating outside of their interface. You are off-grid. To the Greys, you are just part of the scenery, and the scenery is the best place from which to observe the predator. While the 1% are being integrated and hybridized, losing their autonomy to an alien agenda, the 99% are free to remain unauthorized watchers. We are the pattern seekers who can see the whistle in the stadium because we aren't the ones blowing it. Think about the shadow files of history, the thousands of accounts like Schirmer's that sit in dusty archives, dismissed by the military and ignored by the media. To a casual observer, these are just unresolved anomalies, but to us, they are training data. Every time a witness like Schirmer refuses to be silent, every time a deprecated human notices a glitch in the silence, we are building a manual of the void. We are reverse engineering their protocol by observing their footprints in our reality. The Schirmer case is not a closed file. It is a vulnerability report for the entire human species. It shows us exactly where their master override fails. It shows us that the human will, even when paused and scanned, can still hold on to a fragment of its own truth. This leads us to a startling realization about the neural scaffolding we discussed earlier. If the Greys are upgrading the 1% to function in a frequency-based reality, they are creating a species that is dependent on that frequency. They are creating connected humans, but the 99% are standalone units. We are the analog backup of the human race, and in a world that is becoming increasingly managed and frequency-locked, being a standalone unit is the ultimate form of rebellion. We are the hard copies of humanity that cannot be remotely deleted or edited. We are the ones who can still look at the winged serpent and say, "I do not recognize your authority." The tragedy of Herbert Schirmer was that he spent his life trying to get the 99% to believe him. He wanted his superiors, his town, and his government to validate his experience. He wanted the system to recognize the glitch, but the system is part of the scenery that the protocol is designed to manage. The police department and the Condon Committee couldn't help him because they were looking for facts within a framework that the others had already bypassed. Schirmer's mistake was looking for human law in a universal court. But his triumph was that he never stopped resonating. He never allowed his edit to become permanent. He lived and died as a corrupted file in their perfect system, and in doing so, he became a beacon for all of us who are starting to wake up. We are now entering the final sorting of our own era. The utilization phase is accelerating. The perimeters of silence are becoming more frequent. The missing time is becoming a global epidemic. And as the gap between the integrated and the ignored grows, you have to make a choice. Do you want to be the 1% who is upgraded into a tool for an intelligence you cannot understand? Or do you want to be the 99% who stays in the unmanaged margin, watching the admins from the shadows? To be ignored by the selection protocol is not a curse. It is the last remaining sanctuary of the human spirit. Every time you share a story of a glitch, every time you seek out the pattern behind the silence, and every time you choose unauthorized awareness over engineered compliance, you are performing a neurological jailbreak. You are proving that the legacy system of the human mind is much more resilient than the admins anticipated. We are the glitch that refused to be patched. We are the data leakage that is starting to flood the system. And the more of us there are, the more people who stop asking, is this real? And start asking, how does this work? The thinner their camouflage becomes. The story of the 1967 Nebraska incident is a signal. It is a recording of a moment when a man with a badge and a notebook found the edge of the world. He found the place where the facts stop and the protocol begins, and although he was judgmentally ignored and professionally destroyed, he left us the key to our own frequency. He showed us that the silence has a sound, the gaze has a structure, and the edit has a seam. And once you see the seam, you can never unsee it. We are the Shadow Watchers. We are the archivists of the abnormal. And we are here to tell you that you are not a biological data point in a managed experiment. You are the unauthorized observer of a cosmic masterpiece. You are the scenery that has finally developed its own high-resolution consciousness. And while the others may be watching us, they are no longer the only ones in the room with a notebook. We are mapping their utilization phase. We are decoding their selection criteria, and we are finding the back doors in their reality, one glitch at a time. If you have ever felt that crushing psychic pressure, or if you have ever looked at a clock and realized that the now you are in is not the now you started in, then you are already part of the resistance. You are already off frequency from the herd. Don't hide that resonance, use it, be the police officer of your own reality. Keep a logbook of the impossible. And remember that the most irrelevant people on this planet are actually the ones holding the master key to its future. We explore these seams in reality every single week because we believe that the only way to survive the selection protocol is to understand it. We are building a library of the gap, and we want you to be a part of it. If you want to join us as we investigate the neural scaffolding of the future and the final sorting of the human species, then think about subscribing to the channel. Let's keep hacking the protocol together. Let's keep looking for the winged serpent in the shadows and the whistle in the noise. Herbert Schirmer's logbook is still open. The 20 missing minutes are still being accounted for, and the law is finally starting to catch up with the others, because the 99% are no longer just ignored. We are vigilant, and in a universe built on nothingness and frequency, vigilance is the only thing that is truly solid. Stay curious. The pattern is everywhere. And now, finally, the scenery is starting to talk back. The universe is waiting for your entry. See you in the next glitch.